Hello everyone, and today we're going to talk about the history of investor relations. And it's also raining and lightning outside, so if you hear scary noise, it's just thunder, and it's really loud today. So let me start with asking you a question. How old do you think investor relations is? When do you think the first investor relations activities started happening? Do you think it was at the end of the 20th century? Do you think it was in the middle of the 20th century? Maybe even at the beginning of the 20th century? Maybe even before that? 19th, 18th, 17th? I don't know. Take a minute. Try to guess. When do you think investor relations started? You can put me on pause while you're thinking. So now, after you thought about it, I can show you the very first known share that is stored today in the museum in Europe. So now I think that should give you a hint that investor relations is pretty old. As you can see, the whole company, it's the very first shareholding company known in the world, was divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think it was actually 8. So maybe the original share was the original 8 fund as well, into 8 parts, and you could purchase 1/8 of a company, and that allowed the organization to pool resources. If one person could not really support all the operation, then by bringing 8 people together and all their resources, they could support the operations of the company and grow. And this is the share of a company called Stora Kopparberg. 12.8% of shares was sold, and each of these stamps represents 12.5% of shares of the corporation. And it happened on June 16th, 1288. So it is a pretty old company, and this is where we can start calculation of investor relations from. I'm sorry, the rain is so loud, you can probably hear now not just the thunder but also the rain itself. I think I'm gonna pause the video for a second. So Stora Kopparberg was the first shareholding corporation, meaning that ownership of the company was divided into certain shares, and different people owned these different parts of the company. But it wasn't really a publicly traded corporation. That's another term we need to learn today. So shareholding corporation is the one that divides into shares. Publicly traded corporations is a shareholder corporation, so it has shares, but it also open to the public, so anybody can go buy the shares of the company. For example, right now I can go online, log in into E-Trade account, and buy shares of Amazon, for example. It's a publicly traded corporation. Or Facebook, or Tesla, or Beyond Meat, or Netflix, whatever it is. All these companies are publicly traded. Stora Kopparberg was not publicly traded. Not anybody could buy it. You have to be of certain societal status to be able to do it. The first publicly traded corporation is Dutch East India Company. This was the company that was created in Europe in order to explore during the age of geographic discoveries, to explore all these new worlds, that are being discovered, and obviously exploit them for profit as well. And the first shareholder corporation, the first publicly traded corporation, Dutch East India Company, over the years became extremely successful. Some historians even say that at certain points in time, Dutch East India Company was stronger than most governments that existed, than most countries that existed at the time. It had its own fleet, it had its own army, and it had very loyal subjects, the shareholders who bought shares of the Dutch East India Company and then were receiving dividends, were receiving profit from operations of Dutch East India Company. Dividends is the reward that company pays its shareholders usually once a year at the end of the year. If the company collects profits, then it distributes certain percentage of those profits among its shareholders. And Dutch East India Company became so popular and so many people wanted to invest in it and it paid such good dividends that they had to create the whole new institution called a stock exchange. In this case, Amsterdam Stock Exchange. And when it was created, the only stock that was traded at Amsterdam Stock Exchange was Dutch East India Company stock, nothing else. Of course, today at stock exchanges, they usually trade a variety of different shares of different companies, and the name for shares is also stock. So stock and shares can be used interchangeably. But when it all started, it started with one public trade corporation, Dutch East India Company, and one stock exchange, Amsterdam Stock Exchange. And then in the 19th century in the USA, and you can read more about it in the article that I posted on the Blackboard about the history of investor relations. There were stories about the gold mines and irrigation fields and oil fields, and there were a lot of salesmen going door to door selling shares of these gold mines or oil fields. And they created lists that later became marketing lists, where they would record all their contact information, all whom they sold it, and it was called sucker lists, because in many cases there was no truth behind these gold mines or oil fields. It was nothing substantive was behind it. These were people who was just making up those companies in order to sell shares and then collect the money and then disappear. And that really became extremely bad, because many people, farmers, especially farmers in the Midwest, but a lot of other regular folks, were taken advantage of by those door-to-door investor relations salesmen who were selling stuff that did not really exist. And so at the end of the 19th century, many states started introducing the first investor relations laws, the first investor relations legislation, which are now commonly known as blue sky securities. And the reason they're called blue sky securities is because those people were selling blue sky. There is no value in anything they sell. So that's why the name of the laws became blue sky securities. And all of that is considered pre-professional periods, because the profession wasn't really defined. There was no professional organization. There were no regulations about it, until again blue sky securities appeared, and for the first time they started defining what is a corporation, what is a share of the corporation, how you're supposed to sell it, who is supposed to sell it, what is the responsibility, what information needs to be provided. All that started happening after the blue sky securities introduction. But interesting thing is, even after blue sky regulations were introduced, it did not really stop all this fraud in the industry. It was still such a lucrative market that people continued defrauding other people with fake corporations and fake securities. But because blue sky laws were state laws, what happened was they now did it across the state borders, and so they couldn't be prosecuted. So let's say a broker in New York was selling shares to a farmer in Iowa about a company located in California, and state laws could not really prosecute it because everything was happening in different states. It was all outside of jurisdiction of a particular state, the whole transaction. And so the need became for the federal regulations. So here we're talking more about blue sky laws. And the end then of pre-professional period came with introduction of federal regulations. And the main two federal regulations in the United States, even up to today, are 1933 Securities Act and the 1934 Securities Exchange Act. So there is more discussion about them in the book, so I'm not going to talk about them in this presentation. And then with that introduction, we started professional period, and it's commonly divided into three eras: communication era, 45-75, financial era, 75-2005, and synergy era, 2005 to now. And the synergy era, at least theoretically, is the time when both communication and finance expertise are equally valued in the investor relations, and both are utilized in successful contribution to the investor relations profession. So again, you can read more about them that in the chapters submitted in the book, so I'm just going to skip over it. I'm going to talk about the first period, because investor relations grew out of public relations. The very same people who communicated to the public to market the product got tasked with communicating to the public in order to sell the shares of the company. The first shareholders were regular people. It was uncommon to have a giant financial organizations doing all the investing like we see today. So there are some examples, some quotes about what was going on there. And again, they used a lot of marketing tactics, glossy reports, special events, gift boxes, whatever worked for the customers, they decided will work for the shareholders as well. Eventually, the system changed. Essentially, everybody started investing and everybody started getting rich. Eventually, somebody started losing money. The market cannot grow forever. And so then there was a need for professionalization of the market, for advisors, for somebody who can not just give advice, but accumulate money of different regular people and invest on their behalf. So more and more financial institutions started appearing. And obviously, if you are a financial analyst on Wall Street and you want information about the company in order to decide if you should invest in it or not, you're not going to be satisfied with a gift box or a fancy special event. You need actual information. The gift box may be nice, but if you have $50 million to invest, it's your main concern rather than a gift box you can get for it. And so the market started changing. And instead of public relations, instead of communication expertise, financial analysis became one of the ruling forces of investor relations. It became heavily influenced by people from the treasury, people with the financial education, rather than the communication expertise. And again, it worked for some time, but eventually it also led to some problems, specifically the so-called financial creativity and creative accounting. If it's a bunch of financial analysts responsible for all the investor relations activities, eventually they come to realization that no matter what the company is doing, there are ways to manipulate the results. There are ways to do some creative accounting in order to show that the company is growing and increase the share price. And there was a very significant push during this time for higher share price. Everybody was talking about growth of share prices, and the end result was Enron and Wall Crossing and Tyco and many other organizations that were caught manipulating the numbers in order to increase the share price. And that led to the end of the second financial period, and now hopefully the beginning of the third period, where both financial and communication expertise are working together. And the focus is the same as in public relations, on building relationships. One of the, I think it was GE. Oh, no, I think it was Procter & Gamble CEO. I'm not 100% sure what CEO, what company that CEO was from, but he was famous at the beginning of the 21st century for saying that we don't need shareholders anymore. We don't people who buy our shares and hold them and then sell them. We want share owners. We want them to own the company. They want them to have a relationship with us, with the company, be proud that they own this company. And so that is refrain. This is the main idea of the third current period of investor relations. we are joint owners and we are proud of it, and we want to make sure our company is better. It's not about, again, financial creativities, not just about the profits. It's about being good force in this world. And so the chapter we have has a graph on comparison between all these eras of investor relations. And this is all for the history. And next time we'll talk about the modern day investor relations profession.